Good morning. Welcome for this panel on From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. I'm Kevin Walker. You probably know me. You know these guys, so I don't have to introduce them. Thanks so much for coming. Dan Sportello was supposed to take the lead on this, but he had something come up, so I'm taking over. Yeah, let's pray and discuss this wonderful book. Our Father.
All right. I don't know if we want to open it up to some questions first or not. It's the book, summarizes, is capturing some of the challenges that we have in this day and age. In my mind, Christendom's been dead for at least 2.5 centuries more. It probably started to die with the Renaissance in some ways culturally, and then that kind of expanded with the Reformation and then into the Enlightenment. And once the Industrial Revolution hit, it really kind of socially and politically started fragmenting it. So it's kind of like in the Old Testament, you had the rise of the kingdoms, and then the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, and then it lasted for 3 people there, 3 kings, and then it started fragmenting. And there's a place for it out of Christendom, out of the rise after Charlemagne, and that there was some beautiful things that have obviously arisen in Christendom. I mean, we wouldn't have had the university system. We wouldn't have had integrations of canon law and the civilizing of civil law. We wouldn't have had a lot of the hospital systems, the university systems, all kinds of things emerged out of Christendom. And so you have to look at it providentially, how it got put together and what place it had within the Western world. But it definitely started fragmenting. It always had those tensions within between the emperor and the pope from early on even. Sometimes they worked together and sometimes they didn't work together very well. And so it was never an easy marriage. St. John Henry Newman describes the rise of it, though, as with Charlemagne and others, there was this real attempt to bridge together faith and reason within the same civilization. And that had, even in the old Roman Empire, you had Christianity coming into it and even becoming the state religion under Theodosius. And Constantine had kind of kicked that off, but Christianity never permeated the Roman Empire. And Christendom rose not really out of the old Roman Empire, it rose out of the conversion of the barbarians and then the feudal system. And so it was never a rebuilding of old Rome entirely. It was really a new kind of thing that emerged. And Newman notes that. And so there's some things that were really they're great treasures for the church that came out of it. But at the same time, it collapsed in the way that the Old Testament kingdoms collapsed. And there's a providential reason for that. And I'll just stop there, I think, and say that we are in a new age. There's no doubt about that from what Christendom was. And I think we've been in it for some time. So.
I was handed this book when I interviewed at UMary about 4 years ago and read a bunch of it, and I had some downtime during the interview and been intrigued with it ever since. It's a fascinating argument, and one aspect of it that really fascinates me is the fact that he doesn't go into it a lot in the text, but it seems as if God willed for a time that there be Christendom, and then he didn't. For whatever mysterious reason in providence in the mind of God, we are back to an apostolic mission. In a certain sense, we've gone in a big circle. We're back now, if the argument's right, back where we were in the early church. And in a lot of ways, it calls for a new kind of faithfulness and a new perspective on the world and what we have to offer. And the chapter on a new way of seeing is really fascinating. What does it mean to see the world in a Christian way? Leaving aside all the Christian-y things that Christians do, right? What is it to look at the rest of the world and try to understand practices and institutions and our own human nature, just everything we study at a university. in light of grace, in light of its own unique excellence. And I find that to be a really wonderful and challenging chapter that the book presents, and something that maybe we could do in Christendom, maybe we couldn't, depends on what period of history you're talking about or what the conditions were. But Apostolic Mission definitely gives you a whole new advantage in seeing the excellence of things, and more too. One thing the book didn't go into a lot, and with what we're thinking about those, what is it to love out of charity? It is to will the good of the other, right? It is to recognize the excellence of the thing or the person, right? Or maybe the institution, and move it toward that end. Of course, people don't always like that, but still, it's good for them, right? It's to bring them to the glory that they're meant for, that God means them for. Apostolic mission means having a totally unique perspective on what is the excellence of, that person, what is the excellence of that institution, what is the excellence of, this is what I teach, politics, right? And how do we bring it toward its due end and its right order and its own unique glory that God means it for. And I find that a truly exciting challenge for us to face and embrace in our time. So, Father Buck?
Good. After he was voted out of office after winning World War II, Winston Churchill came to a college in Missouri, of all places, and gave his famous, "An iron curtain has fallen upon Europe." And now today, you'll remember this day when Dr. Fleischacker declared, "Christendom is dead and has been dead for 200 years." And so this is the great Fleischacker speech. But I think first of all, this book is acknowledging a reality that's indisputable, and it's important to just sort of live in that. Nostalgia, in the Greek sense, is pain for a time that's gone by. It's a pain, and there's a certain pain involved when we lose something. But it's also part of the stages of grief to find acceptance. It's just a stage of life that has gone by. Furthermore, when you study history, it's important not to see if you sort of see the 1,000 years of Christendom that you were describing. It's not this like these were the glory days and the glory days are behind us, and now we're kind of like putting the pieces back together of something as a sort of second-rate institution. Once upon a time, the Dallas Cowboys are really good, and they still have a lot of the impact of that in their marketing and stuff. But they're just a declining empire. That's not the way the church is at all. And then you look closer at this 1,000 years, and you see it wasn't the glory days either. There were some things that were glorious, but even I was just looking back into the wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation, and there's all these battles between kind of Christendom and Gustavus Adolphus, and this whole war that was going on, ravaging Christian Europe. And the one who tipped the scales to kind of permanently dismantle Christendom in a certain way was Cardinal Richelieu, who was the Prime Minister of France. So he's a Catholic cardinal, and he took Catholic France and fought against the Catholic Habsburgs, right? And fact-checking so good so far. And so what enshrined sort of even why you go 10 miles west of here, you have New Salem, which is historically a Protestant town. Then you go 10 miles west of there, and then there's Glen Ellen, a historically Catholic town. Then you go 10 miles west of there, there's Hebron, a historically Protestant town. That's thanks to Cardinal Richelieu, because he sent his troops in. And so even Christendom, if you think of Christendom in its 1,000 years or whatever, depending on when you look at it, it wasn't this rosy picture constantly of like the church in her glory was just dominating, and everyone was just like, man, it's so easy to be a saint. It's like, read the lives of the saints during this period, and you realize they were facing many struggles. Think of your bishop, who you may or may not like, and then also think of your governor, who you may or may not like, and then think of that person as the same person. And that is, a lot of the experience of Christendom, where you see your spiritual leader as the guy who's also taxing you and taking your lands and declaring war on other bishops. And many things like that are part of like filling it out. In the book, Christendom is a way of seeing, and I think the chapter that Dr. Walker, you mentioned, that's so helpful, is what you're trying to say. Here's a way of seeing. A way of seeing is recognizing this age is different than ages that have come before, even though institutions and sort of habits of mind are still preserved in how we think. Namely, the buildings on this campus, if you go around the United States of America, when are most of the buildings built? the 1950s and the 1960s. And that's in our imagination. That's the way the church was. Well, that was a very specific time in history of religious revival, the baby boom. And so it was like build, 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 build. And then after a decline. So you think like everything was like this since Jesus. From 33 AD to 1959 or 1965, things were just on the up and up. And then now only since 1965, things have just cratered. Of course, that's not true at all. I mean, any sort of cursory study through history will reveal that's not true at all. But we have that in the back of our mind sometimes to think, okay, this is the first time the church has ever been in decline. Conversely, it's crazy to think, as this emphasized one of my favorite pages of the book, is like, look at the list of resources in the early church, 12 priests, a few hundred faithful. And they didn't have in their mind to set out to say, hey, guys, let's sit around the table, what's your budget, what's your, what are your work hours, what are your opportunities? And what we want by the end of this project is to have a $1.5 billion or 1.5 billion person global organization. So let's get at it. They didn't say, hey, let's tear down the Roman Empire, right? Let's show that the Jewish power over the temple and the Messiah, that's going away for 2,000 years. They didn't set out to do any of those things. What they set out to do, to go teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, into the particular communities that they were sent to, and all of this by holiness of life, union with Christ, and living out the action of the Holy Spirit that had just descended upon them and radically transformed them. Then you look at another pivotal moment in sort of church history, which you study in Benedict yesterday and today, is say, what were these monks doing? They sat around another round table and said, hey, culture is declining, what should we do? Let's save culture. No, they said, what should we do? We should be saints. We should live a way of life that allows us to be holy, and we should preserve the Bible, because that's important to pass the Bible on. And they said, okay, we have a little extra time today. What should we preserve? Preserve a book on physics, too. Okay, great. Preserve this cookbook, from ancient times. And so then they did that. And that did save culture, and that's what you learn about, how the monks saved civilization, how the Irish saved civilization. You don't, historically speaking, you don't set out to say, okay, how can we save civilization? A lot of people say that today. How can we save civilization? And, of course, those are the people that are, like, part of political philosophies that come and go. Dr. Fleischacker has the sequel to this book, which is more of like a diagnostic manual of saying, the people that go out and say, we need to, as Marx says, make the world a better place, or as the fascists say, recreate the glories of Rome, or recreate the glories of this time and place. And they did, Mussolini. If you go around Rome, the good thing about the Romans is they don't tear things down. They just kind of, yeah, we had horrible Roman emperors. Yeah, we had fascists. Yeah, I don't want to tear that stuff down. It's kind of cool and whatever. We got other things to do. You got to take a nap. And so you have these fascist monuments of Mussolini that are still standing, and they say that he renumbered the years from the reign of his empire. And then you look at his empire. He couldn't even conquer the Ethiopians. He's supposed to be this big bad country, and he couldn't even remotely. He couldn't even beat the Greeks. He couldn't beat anyone. But it was this, we have to restore the glory of Rome. And he dies hanging from a lamp pole in complete shame. It didn't work. We as Christians can say, well, God clearly wants us to reestablish Christendom or reestablish some sort of culture. But what does he really want us? He wants us to be saints. As a result of being saints, he may have us do these various other things. But that's not where we start out with. Look at the Catholic school systems. Pope Benedict said, the Catholic school system in the United States is one of the great things that the church in America has provided. How did that start? Not by a bunch of bishops sitting around and saying, we're going to start a Catholic school system. It started by Elizabeth Ann Seton saying, hey, there's a need, and I'm going to respond to that need. And then it blossoms. And we just had the Feast of St. John, I pronounce it Newman. Some people say Neumann, not John Henry, but the Bishop of Philadelphia. And he's like, wow, there's a lot of poor immigrant kids who need schools. What do? Build some schools. And that's what happened. They didn't say, we need to create the greatest educational system in world history. They said, we need to educate these kids that are in front of us. And then over time, that blossoms into this particular thing. The fun, interesting thing about all of this is from the time of Christ until today, unbroken, the church has done nothing but increase. This is not some sort of guarantee. But when we're looking at this book, too, we look at the church is in decline. No, the church is not in decline. The church is ever increasing. After the Protestant Reformation, the church responded in a way. In some ways, it lost Europe. In other ways, it had the greatest missionary expansion of all time. after the Second Vatican Council, tons of issues, tons of dogmatic confusion, tons of catechetical lapses, and the church has done nothing but grow. Now, has it grown in the former lands of Christendom in the West? No. But what else is happening in the lands of Christendom in the West? It's decaying and dying on its own. Like, people always say, oh, the church in Belgium, look at how this, look how that. Belgium's going away. The Belgians are going away. They're not reproducing. And so you say that, but look at the church is increasing in growth faster than the world population, and the places that the world population is growing is where the church is growing the fastest. You know, if Iran topples, think of the Christian growth that could possibly happen in a place like that. But then look at where all the population growth is happening: Southeast Asia, Africa. The church is blossoming. If you say the sentence, "the church is in decline," that is empirically, verifiably false sentence. The Catholic Church is actually not in decline remotely. Its institutions are full globally, and baptisms and ordinations and religious life, it's increasing and actually thriving. And this has actually been the story of the Church throughout all of history. Even at its darkest moments is when it experiences often its greatest growth and where the greatest saints come out. Is it declining in places where it had been thriving? Yes, but that's also sort of the circle of life in the world of the church. Look at where did the church grow immediately? You know, Armenia, Ethiopia, the Middle East. You know, that's not the center of Christianity anymore. Then West became the center of Christianity. Well, then America has kind of become a sort of center of Christianity, more than Europe. And then now Africa and India and Southeast Asia are becoming. So it's this sort of like, you have to have a global perspective and a historical perspective to start considering these things before you start saying like, well, if we just did this, then everything would be better. It's like, well, you know, just be a saint and then, you know, see what God is calling you to in that moment. Even this book was just to set out some ideas and clarify some thoughts and to be sort of an illustration of a perspective that this university is taking, and if it could be helpful to other people, then so be it. And what happened? It sold over 100,000 copies around the country. Bishops are buying it and having their whole diocese, all the priests of their diocese read it. They're starting study groups. Well, it didn't. When they wrote this book, it wasn't like, let's write a book that's going to become a bestseller or whatever. It was just, hey, let's put our thoughts down as best we see them and discerning how the Holy Spirit's moving in this day and age. And, you know, Shazam, it becomes something that strikes a nerve in the church today. So sometimes just having a little bit more perspective on these questions can help illustrate what my role is and how I'm supposed to respond to the needs of the time.
Great, wonderful. We can open it up to questions, I suppose, or we can ask each other questions. Any thoughts on Apostolic Mission? Everyone clear on the difference, first of all, between Christendom and Apostolic Mission? Yeah.
So is Apostolic Mission mostly just like evangelization, or is it like seeing like the modern world just through like a Catholic lens?
That's what it culminates in, yeah, seeing the modern world that way. But it also means recognition that culture and institutions and society and politics is not, right, as influenced by the church as it used to be. And that's okay, because it offers a new opportunity. Evangelization is part of that, of course, and a variety of other things, but does that make sense? Yeah, good. Dan, you're here.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was talking about you.
Yeah, it was a near thing. So, I guess this is for all of you. I have the temptation, rightly or wrongly, to say that it would have been better had Christendom never happened at all. Is that a temptation I should resist, or is that a temptation that is right?
I have a kind of a funny meditation on this. So it's like Constantine's at the Milvian Bridge. He defeats Maxentius. He takes over Rome. A lot of people, especially some sort of Protestants or sort of liberal Catholics, would say like, well, this is when Christendom declined. Again, we should just, or when the Christian faith declined, not Christendom, the Christian faith. We should just be wary of sort of these judgment statements, I think, in general, especially as I began to say, like, it's just a fact. What Dr. Fleischacker described is just a fact. So it's just like, it's important just to acknowledge that it was a fact, you know, versus sort of passing sort of some sort of moral judgment. And with all things, there's benefits and drawbacks. But let's say the faith, for the sake of argument, the faith was this sort of pure thing during the time of martyrdom. Fine. Okay, well, look at the faith during the time of martyrdom. That's when the Gospel of Thomas is written. That's when these wacko Gnostic cults were thriving. That's when heresy was rampant. Sometimes you'll think, everyone was wonderful in the time of Christ even. Oh, to be then, look at Judas. Look at these horrible people. Look at Ananias and Sapphira. Read the epistles of St. Paul not as spiritual meditation sometimes, but read them as what he actually is writing them and saying, get your act together. Hey, 1 Corinthians 10, stop getting drunk at Mass. You guys are getting drunk, you're fighting with each other. This is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to take bread, you're supposed to take wine, and stop fighting with each other. This early church is not some idyllic, this is an important point too. This early church is not some idyllic time that we're trying to get back to. And that's not what this book is saying either, that let's get back to the early church. That's what a lot of people in the 70s were saying, like, let's get back to the time when everyone was a hippie. It's like they were not hippies. They were a lot of things and a whole panoply of different ways of seeing. So anyway, let's say that it was better in this time of martyrdom where everyone was pious and dying of martyrdom, and then the legalization and the establishment of Christianity was this great negative thing. Well, what's Constantine supposed to do? He obviously did a lot of immoral things in his own life and did a lot of different things. But if he said Christianity is the true religion and this is what I believe, should he have said, and so to help the church, I'm actually going to keep persecuting the church to make sure that everyone stays holy, it doesn't get corrupt because they're going to take these different positions. It's like, sometimes on campus we have so many spiritual opportunities. This thought crosses my mind where it's like, we're going to ban all masses on campus. If mass attendance, because then, 1,000 people will be like, we want mass. But it's like, we're expanding our mass options for you. I'm tired. I have chicken nuggets to eat. I don't want to go to mass. So there's these sort of, these things that you weigh, but I think you do it the best with what you've been given. But as this book says, during Christendom, the benefit was the way of seeing was more aligned, right? It was more of a cultural way of seeing overall. But the drawback becomes, because it's so familiar, then corruption and a sort of laziness around sanctity in the faith. One of my favorite people is St. Francis of Assisi. He grew up in the 12th century in Assisi in Italy. So there's no more Catholic time, Catholic culture, da-da-da-da. Was it easy for him to be a saint? It wasn't easy for him to be a saint at all. He had to reject his family, and he had to live his entire life. First of all, he was fighting battles, like physical, mortal battles against Perugia. No place was as Catholic as Assisi and Perugia, and they're related to each other. They're both Umbrians. They're both like part of the same ethnic tribe. They're part of the same religion, and they're fighting these weirdo kind of like battles of honor and killing each other about it. This is read Dante. All the stuff he hates is like primarily other Italians and other Catholics. And so the call to be a true saint is a radical call in every time and place. Now there was benefits to it though, where Catholic culture was seeping into the world, and things like the university and the hospital come up, and human rights and various things that evolve in sort of a Christian context. But the individual call to be a healthy church was also a radical choice at that time.
Yeah. Per Dan's question, I think about how very often when people think of restoring Christendom and defending Christendom, they're not thinking in terms of what it did and its great legacy, which really was extraordinary. And it lists it very nicely, the end of slavery, universities, parliaments, cathedrals, hospital, long list. And those are all very good, extraordinary things. More often what people today mean by it, at least as far as I hear it, is we need to bring back prayer in public schools and Bible reading and basically restoring the Christians to a privileged position in society as a special class of people. That's not at all what that's not at all what it was historically. They turn it into a form of identity politics, really, which is always a mistake because it doesn't really contribute to civil deliberation or the common good. It's more about like what's good for us. Christendom, hooray. People talk about religious liberty in much the same way. It's for the religious people. No, it's for the common good. It's a totally different question. But so, any thoughts on that?
On Dan's question?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we wouldn't exist if there wasn't a Christendom.
Yeah.
I guess I'm glad it did exist historically. Sort of like if Socrates hadn't been born, we probably wouldn't be here either. Just like if Jesus hadn't been. So just look at the sequencing of things. But anyway.
Right, it's the fact.
I'm pretty sure you wouldn't exist. But
Would you defend that claim?
if World War II hadn't existed, would you exist now? Just to go to something more close
My
to?
intuitive answer is yes, but can you?
Okay, so where did your parents meet? Like mine would never have met probably, but in the way they did, so.
Okay,
Baby boomer.
but that, yeah, I don't think.
You don't have to go back too many generations, and you can see the circumstances of parents getting together, the delays after World War II. Many marriages were delayed till after World War II, so most kids born wouldn't have been born now that are in the world. You would have had only a few places, you know. Other parts of the world may be untouched, but in the European world, if Christendom didn't exist, I guarantee you 100% you would not exist. There's no way. Unless you lived in like Antarctica or something and had like 80 generations there, and that you never moved off of it until, you know, the 1930s or something. So there's no way you would exist.
But
If
are
you
you,
come
say,
from
are you saying sort of a Rousseauian, like, Christianity where it's like, if it hadn't been, like, basically Christendom was this evil thing, and if it wouldn't have existed, Christianity would have flourished better?
Not really.
Okay.
Everything you three said was very interesting, but it didn't really touch on my question. If only in order to defend myself, let me clarify that I believe quite strongly that Christianity should be legal. That was not, what I actually had in mind was that it strikes me. Constantine seems to have been something of a bastard, but let's leave him out of this. I only know what I learned from Evelyn Waugh. That said, the real problem seems to be the simultaneous persecution of non-Christians, which is icky in hindsight, but even more problematic, the way in which the Constantinian dynasty turned Christianity into an apparatus of state power. Like that strikes me as the problem. And then you have, 1,500 years later, you have Talleyrand becoming bishop because it's the clearest way to power, even though he's an atheist, right? For example.
He was a true believer.
Was he?
Yeah, in the end.
In the end?
Yeah.
Really? I haven't heard that.
Yeah. He did everything. He did.
David has something, yeah.
How does the teaching of students at a university in an apostolic age differ from the teaching of students at a university in a Christendom age?
No, good.
I don't know, because I never taught in a Christendom age, but it was dead at least 2.5 centuries ago.
At least in theory, based upon both.
In comparisons, no, I think, the universities then were just starting off, and so you had a lot of them were clerics and others, so it was a different bunch. It was like teaching a little more in seminaries and things like that. So you had an audience that was there for a different reason. Some of them were, very few were even sons of princes or kings or something, or so it was mostly clerics, I think, in the Christendom, most of the Christendom area in the early parts, and not until in the late 1400s and that do you get increasing numbers, I think, of lay people entering into the university world, and the rise of the liberal arts stuff and that in Czechoslovakia, for example, and even with like Wick and Huss and all those characters. If you go back, that's in the 1400s. So you really didn't have, you had a different audience in front of you, and you're teaching. Theology obviously would have been prominent. Philosophy was growing at times, coming and going. You didn't have all the subjects that we would have now. They did have canon law, and they had medicine, so you had schools that were teaching that. But it was people that were already. It was a different kind of group of students that was in front of you, completely different, I think, than what we would have now, especially with the rise of national education movements, and then the need. Newman kind of notes this, that after he called the sort of the Christendom age as being the ecumenic university, where you had students coming in from all over the known world into the University of Paris or other places like that, but they were all there because they wanted to be, and not all of them. That's not true. They did have fights between the town and gown. Have you heard of that? So they were a bunch of guys who, many of them were clerics, but they also were roughnecks. So I think they got into fights a lot of times with the city and the region there. I'm just trying to piece together what it would have been like to teach there. I generally think you would have had, think of it. So you had someone like St. Albert the Great, and in his classroom he had Bonaventure and St. Thomas, so you had a different kind of group in front of you, is what I would think. But with the national education movements, we get everyone from all over the place. They're coming in from all different walks of life. They have different needs, different things going on, and so it's quite a different kind of group. Some of you don't really want to go to all your classes, from what I hear, or go through all the classes that you have to go through. And I imagine that happened to some degree there as well, but I just don't know the degree. So I can't answer the question. I'm going to step out of it. I have no idea.
I worry that we're conflating this sort of amount of people who have a Christian conviction or Christian belief with what the book refers to as a Christendom age. Where it's a Christendom age not as the number of Christians we have, but the fact that the dominant cultural view, the dominant imaginary vision of the culture is informed by the Christian imaginary vision. So in Christendom age, even if you think about like the last stages of the Christendom age, you might have very few practicing Christians, but they might generally sort of inhabit this worldview that is in accord with sort of Christian teaching or certain understanding of things. Where in apostolic age, you don't have the Christian imaginary vision, Catholic imaginary vision isn't the dominant view. It's something entirely different. And so I think that was the sort of question around, like what things can we no longer take for granted in an apostolic age in the classroom that maybe we could have 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's less about religious conviction.
I mean, when I was teaching 30, 40 years ago, there was definitely not a consistency then either. So I would say now I've seen things become different. Now Mary is a little different than other places I've been to. So, but there is less knowledge in a general way of, you're right, of the Christian vision of things. But I don't know if that Christian vision, honestly, when it comes to how we've lived together politically, socially, economically, even in our families, in our family units, I don't think that's been around for a long time in any real profound way that's permeated and transformed those things. I think that's been gone for a long, long time, even in more than a century, even in the everyday population. If you look at the populations that are running things economically and politically, you go back to the rise of the Enlightenment and all that, and then the development of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, or go back to Jefferson and all them. Did they have a Christian view of the world? I would be hard. He had taken elements of it, right, but he was deist and other things. So you already had there the people running things. I'm not sure that you could say that most of them even had a real serious Christian view of the world anymore, of how they were living or what they were about. When the founders wanted to build America into a new Rome, for example, or whatever, they were using non-Christian kind of models for that. They weren't using Christendom. They were using old Rome and the glory of Rome for that. And so I don't know if the sort of when you look at the Chase, or you look at all the major what's the guy with Standard Oil, Rockefellers, you look at all of them, why did they do what they did? It wasn't for Christian reasons, and it wasn't a Christian vision that we're living out of. So the ones who kind of set up all the framework of our economic life and our political life, I don't think they actually built something out of a Christian view. If anything, it was, as Vogelin calls it, kind of a taking of elements of the Christian life and what it meant, but then immanentizing it, taking it and putting it into their visions, but it was a very worldly vision in the end, just like communism was, or others. So I'm not sure that any of the economic and political life that we've had for a long, long time was built out of a Christian vision. And we've all assumed it as just the way of life, part of our way of life.
I mean, as Christians looking at something like the Constitution, though, isn't there a kind of excellence of the system of government pursuant to the common good that we, even from an apostolic vision, can affirm? Or is it just like if you look at civil authorities are there to rule for the common good, to govern for the common good, right? I mean, you can say that in a secular way, really, as a Christian viewing it from apostolic vision, because it's the good of the thing, right? That's completely different from the,
There was a study done back in the 1990s, and I don't remember if it was out of like Harvard or where. It was either Harvard or it was happening because I was in grad school then at Boston College, and it was a study on how at that time how the federal judges were making decisions and what the basis of their decisions were, And it was over 70% of the judges at that point no longer believed in natural law or the common good. All they believed in was precedent, and then steering things the way they wanted to. And that was the federal court system. And that was back in the 1990s already.
Yeah.
So it's the common good. I think we have it. I think in reality people do live for it in different ways, whatever they've constructed of that common good, whether it's a utopian kind of thing or something. They do have some vision hidden, even if they say there isn't. But I don't know if what we would mean with some kind of common good that springs out of human nature and the natural order of things. I don't think they actually hold that and haven't held that for a long time.
But
One thing that's like, when I was studying in college, like I came in a practicing Catholic, and like the benefit of what my education gave me was understanding that there even was like an imaginative vision. I was like, okay, there's Catholic and this is true, and then there's these things and there's facts. But the whole way of seeing that evolved, that made me even firmer in my faith. But also, like, I remember my mind being blown in these classes to say, like, this way that I've always seen things isn't actually like Dr. Fleischhacker was saying. Like, you know, you could take a practicing Catholic from a kind of a Catholic town, Dickinson or whatever, a Catholic family, and like my way of seeing was very modern secular Protestant, modern secular more so. Even the fact of thinking, and this is why I go back to Dan's question too, of like thinking like there's some like thinking secular is neutral. Like I just would assume, okay, secular is neutral, and then there's competing faiths or whatever. But if you look at like the history of civilizations, vertical alignment is actually the norm. So if you go to Egypt, the pharaoh would have been in charge of worship. If you go to Rome, the emperor was the pontifex. The whole society was centered around, first of all, the gods, and then the common life, and then the way that society was organized. And you can see this even in the Old Testament, where it's like David offers a sacrifice to God, and is not like, he's not criticized for that, and he's criticized for a lot of things. But it was seen sort of as his right as a king, that a king offers sacrifice as sort of the arch religion individual office holder in the civilization. And he wasn't a priest; he wasn't a descendant of Aaron. This is the norm. It's actually in what Constantine did is he created, but Christianity upholds, that you can't serve both God and mammon, render under Caesar's, what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's, from the Christian principle in history 300 years later. And so it's actually that separation of like what is seen as Caesar's and secular and what is seen as God's as the spiritual sphere created that separation for the first time really in human history, where there now are like two poles of authority. And you see that played out in Christendom, where these different poles are combating against each other, which I think, to defend your question or whatever, that's actually a good thing. When the spiritual sphere and the secular sphere are actually kind of pushing back against each other with their legitimate spheres of authority, that's good. When they get merged, and this happens from time to time, that's when it's not as healthy. But it's actually, it's one of the great goods. You listed the goods of Christianity and Christendom. It was actually one of the great goods of Christendom to insert that sort of distinction between the spiritual sphere and the secular sphere, or the worldly administration of things, so much so that you see these sort of interplays, and you see the overlap and the downside. Like I mentioned, Cardinal Richelieu doesn't seem like an episode that we'd be particularly fond of from a Christian perspective. And then you see that after Christendom separates, it reverts back to the natural order of things. So when Henry VIII breaks out of true Christendom and does his version of Christianity, what gets vertically aligned again? The church and the state. When the Protestant churches break off from the Catholic Church, they don't just become like the same thing as before. They become vertically aligned, where now the prince is in charge of the church of the local place. Look at all of the churches that were the Protestant churches that broke off after the wars of religion. You have the Church of Norway, you have the Church of Finland. This is a state statskyrka. This is the state church, and this is under the crown, that was not the case during Christendom. Then you say, well, that went away with the secular revolutions. Well, no, in France, they realigned, not under like secularism as a neutral thing, but that's where religion of the day is very helpful to say it was the state church of reason and official atheism. Then you see the rise of communism is the same thing. It was a state church of utopian. And what happens when you're a heretic in these churches? You get persecuted, And so the church, the church's activities throughout these years are not beyond reproach in its individual members. But it is the slow, agonizing evolution of saying this is the way it should be, which is part of the beauty of the American experiment. Because, first of all, when the Founding Fathers said there's no established church, that's what they were saying. They weren't saying religion is deleted from the public sphere. That's what the French Revolution said at the same time in history, basically. No, they said, we're not going to have Henry the Church's Anglican Church run our religious discourse. Why? Because we had Quakers and Shakers and Puritans and all these people, and so we're not going to have one church that people feel excluded from, which is part of the founding of our country. But how did America last? Because human society needs a common religion, and it needs a common worship, and it needs a common purpose in life and definition of society. And that's the way it was for a long time, is white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism generally. What was one of the reasons the Catholic schools were formed? Not because of the depravity and degradation of sort of like anti-Christianity. It was because they were using the King James Bible in the schools, and that was seen as not like the full Catholic Bible. I mean, imagine if that was their main gripe, is that they were teaching, in the public schools, they're only using the King James Bible. It's not funny. And then you go fast forward to, it's really only since the 1950s, with the Supreme Court case, and then the 70s, it kind of took off more in universities and stuff to see there's a competition. What we're experiencing in our culture war right now is, what is the official religion of the United States? Is it this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Enlightenment sort of feed-in evangelicals, and they need the church, like in the Protestant world, they need the state church to have the structure to survive, and they feel threatened. So that's why you have the evangelical voting bloc to say, we don't have a structure to support us, and we feel threatened, we can't have a culture. Then you have the religion of the day, the real progressive, secular, Marxist religion that's also trying to be the dominant religion. And someone's trying to take the cultural crown, because all cultures need one cult. That's what makes cultures the cult. What is our cult in America? Well, we're in a cultural civil war right now, because we're in a cultic civil war. Then the Catholics are around, which is in some ways to defend it too. Why has Catholicism thrived in this country? Why is Notre Dame called the Fightin' Irish? Because the Irish were persecuted, and they weren't allowed to go into the Ivy Leagues, and so they said, we're going to build our own Ivy League school in Indiana, and then, which is like the wilderness in that way of thinking. What were all the Ivy League schools? They were Protestant seminaries. These weren't seculars, they were Protestant seminaries. And so the church has always had this sort of, we're not the official religion, and so we have to create our own structure. And what has the church in the United States done? It's created a parallel structure, which is why you have a whole educational system, you have a whole hospital system, you have a whole university system, because that's what Christendom did, was create culture, and that's what the Christendom's children who were exported to this land, they created a whole structure within the confines of America, which was very permissive, to say, yes, you can do this, because we're not going to forbid Catholicism, even though popularly people were trying to forbid Catholicism and persecute Catholicism, because it represented the old superstitious, restrictive, bad old world that we left. That's why we came here in the first place, was to escape Christendom, and now here comes Catholicism rearing its ugly head again. So there's this competition in the United States, which is funny, because really it's a battle between that WASP religion that was the American religion and the culture for a large percentage of its history. Then you have the progressive Marxist religion that's competing, and then Catholics are caught in between. Now, if you look at culturally, intellectually, what are Catholics a lot of times? Not Catholic, not in their way of seeing, which is the point of this book. So you come into a world of higher ed, and you probably are more actually an adherent of the progressive socialist Marxist religion, or of the WASP religion, or what it's evolved into today, which is the evangelical conservative religion, which has a new denomination, which is Trumpism. So that's like this weird denomination that's splintered off from it. And so you have these competing elements, and Catholics who don't necessarily know what Catholic culture is, they find a camp, and they say, so what do you do on Sunday? That's not what we're talking about, what you do on Sunday. America doesn't care what you do on Sunday. That's been one of the things that's established in our country. Martin Luther King had this great, there's no more segregated hour than 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Okay, so Sunday, private life. But in your public life, you better adhere to the state religion. The only problem is right now there's two competing things for the state religion. There's sort of the evangelical world, which is sort of having its own divorce into MAGA sort of evangelicalism, and then like I reject Trump evangelicalism. And then you have the socio-Marxist, which, that's when, why do you have cancel culture? Well, it's the same thing as like the Inquisition, where it's like, that's not the Inquisition is not a Catholic invention, it's the norm. A society has to have norms. Why were the Christians persecuted in the first centuries? Not because they believed in Jesus, but because they didn't adhere to the common civil organizing principle of culture, which was the worship and the civil life of the Roman gods. This is sort of a natural way that a society is governed. You can't have a society that doesn't have common principles. And the most fundamental common principles is what we believe on the most important levels of life, and that's why we have sort of a cultural divorce. So I think we're experiencing some of the effects in the secular religious divide that actually Christianity is responsible for saying there actually is an independent structure of thought that is more important than the civil order. On the other hand, the civil order is to serve the ultimate good, but it's a marriage that needs both. What is the civil power? An army with guns. So that has a certain level of effect. What's the spiritual power? Well, historically, it was excommunication. So if a prince was getting out of line, the Pope would say you're excommunicated. Now that carried with it the ability to have sort of civil ramifications too. But in terms of like the both poles having authority and power, and not one dominating the other, but working in a sort of really difficult marriage, that's like what is the Christian goal. That did thrive for years with episodes that were more like, we look back on and say that was really helpful, and then episodes that were actually much more problematic and shameful.
Yeah.
That's
Question. Yeah, thank you, David. Student questions? I guess we kind of said it, but I mean, how do we respond to those who are still in the Christendom mentality? What would you say to them? And again, it's more of a mentality than an actual mission so much, but we were talking beforehand, and you put it very well, that very often what people mean by Christendom, or at least the Christendom mentality, is more often a strand or kind of a leftover of something from the fuller, more robust Christendom of centuries past. But like I mentioned, prayer in public schools, that would restore Christendom.
Well, some of the things that it talks about here which are helpful, which is like allocating resources with apostolicity in mind, or rethinking how we use our institutions. I think, the structure that is created from the exportation of Christendom to the United States, it's saying, okay, I'm in an institution, how do I now use it? Not the way, this is the North Dakota, this is the state motto of North Dakota. Well, it's always been that way. Well, you have to look, how are we going to now use something in a way? UMary's a perfect example of this, is saying, okay, we came from a different time, but how are we going to use our resources differently? And then you see the emergence of new organizations like Focus, or different things that are totally new, where it's responding to the needs in a particular way, saying the same old CCD classes at your parish, that's not going to work anymore. Did it ever work? I don't know.
I love how the book uses the term countercultural a lot. Speaking of institutions, right? And the example is, of course, of marriage. Young couple gets married, stays married, has children, is open to life. They're countercultural in a very good way, in a way that's not so much what they preach, but there's the example that they set to the world, and the joy of.
And sometimes it's just inviting people over to your house.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that's a major evangelization initiative.
Yeah. Right. Any final thoughts? Wonderful.
Chad.
Yeah, so I was going to ask just what do you guys see towards the future?
Yeah.
We talked a lot about discussing the past and looking back. Do you have any thoughts that you could share about what you see towards the future? Hopes, realistically, what you see?
Heaven. That's the future. But that said,
I think if you look at the pattern, it's the same. Like you go back to Jerusalem when Jesus was executed there, and then the apostles started dispersing, right, and then they had to bring what he gave to them to other parts of the world, up to Antioch and some other places. When the old Roman Empire started collapsing, the barbarian groups, the Vandals, all these Goth groups and that came in, and they started taking in. These groups came in, and then all of a sudden Rome was already weakened from the inside and was collapsing. But then the church had to then look toward the barbarians. They started converting, and so then it moved into that world. So every time something good collapses, it's like a seed that then grows into new things, and that's Christ's image, right, of the seed dying and then something grew. And I think if you think of how the structure of the cross works, the death, resurrection, ascension, how that whole thing works, it just plays out again. So Christendom had some great things about it, and I know I'm indebted to it in many different ways. and glad it did exist in my case. If it didn't, I think we'd be in a very dire strait in our world, and I'm pretty sure I wouldn't exist. But as it collapsed, you had then this rising up of these new challenges, the Enlightenment, the modernity with the Industrial Revolution, the shifting of agricultural cultures into new city regions and huge metropolises. And so we have a whole new world that we've barely even begun to touch on how to live in it as if faithfully. These are cities that have never been seen in the world, and the scope of it. And you have democratic orders, not monarchies, not other kinds of orders. And so you have to deal with how the faith is going to live out in that context as well. And so I think it's just the growth of the faith now into this whole new region that's also spreading through the whole world in a whole different way, in perhaps ways that it didn't before. So I see all kinds of opportunities that are emerging because of this seed dying and then all these new things that have been emerging out of it. And so it's quite a, I mean, as the book points out, this is an exciting age to be in, but it's going to be with tremendous suffering, because if you know, I mean, where a lot of you young people have come from and the suffering you've already gone through just even in the last decade or so, things that family life, everything that's getting challenged or destroyed or how many of my friends now even believe anymore? I grew up in a Polish neighborhood in the Twin Cities, and I can say on my hand, none of us, except for me and a kid who didn't believe when he was growing up and now believes because he married one of the Catholic women down the street. So it's just one of those odd things. I've seen all of these people leave the faith, and they haven't come back, after they had kids. And so it's been very, very devastating, and there's tremendous suffering and all that. But at the same time, that's how the faith spreads, to the law of the cross.
Good. Very
That's
good.
because Gen Z is the greatest generation, so they're gonna do it. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.